The women in my family were notorious thieves. Bathrobes, coffee mugs, flower vases, salt and pepper shakers. If someone admired it, you could be reasonably sure it would show up in a powder room or on a coffee table the next time you visited. Most immigrant families just wanted a piece of the American pie. Mine wanted the silver-plated pie server, too. My life of petty crime began at age 6, during a brief stop at Winn-Dixie on the outskirts of Fort Lauderdale. This was back when South Florida was still Southern, when the KKK met at the IHOP on Route 1, and alligators roamed the backyards of unsuspecting suburbanites. It was back when Winn-Dixie sold boiled peanuts by the pound, before they carried kosher meat or had an ethnic food section. It was while my mother was cashing a check at the customer service counter that I first encountered that most stunning and irresistible of childhood fantasies come true, the bulk candy aisle. Rows of acrylic bins full of brightly colored candy lined the aisle, each with its own small metal scoop. I ran my hand along the smooth surface of the bins, surveying the scene. It was gastronomical manna from kindergarten heaven. There were shiny speckled jawbreakers, jelly beans and exotic flavors like toasted marshmallow and pina colada, sheets of candy buttons, rolls of licorice string, giant nonpareils, uniform squares of caramel cream, robin's eggs, malted balls, lollipops the size of 45s, and an assortment of hard candies in bold metallic wrappers. The bottom row contained the full spectrum of gummy treats. Gummy fruit, gummy bears, gummy fish, gummy rings, gummy cola, and gummy worms, all available in plain and sour varieties. But there, between the root beer barrels and the miniature Charleston chews, I discovered my vice. An exquisite orb of satiny white taffy, embedded with tiny squares of jewel-toned gumdrops. When I opened the bin to take a closer look, the magnetized cover whipped out of my hand, attaching itself with vice-like tenacity to the bin above with a loud snap. Startled, I looked around to see if anyone had noticed. At the end of the aisle, my mother stood with her back to me, chatting animatedly with the woman behind the counter. I reached into the bin and gingerly removed 2 pieces. The waxy wrappers were smooth and perfectly crimped at each end. The Play-Doh-y texture yielded slightly under pressure, promising an experience of supreme chewability. The bouquet was a mixture of cherry, vanilla, and fresh-baked sugar cookie with just a hint of coconut on the finish. I was inhaling this intoxicating blend when the guttural tone of my mother's unmistakable Bronx accent pierced the serenity of my candy-coated dream. Without hesitation, I shoved my treasure into the pockets of my terry jumper and ran to meet her. Back in the car, I unwrapped one of the pillowy chews and stuffed it into my mouth. I adjusted my seatbelt while lashing my tongue and wrenching my jaw against the rapidly expanding mass of salty, sweet goo. But the car did not start. "What are you eating?" my mother asked, infusing the what with a familiar mixture of concern and disgust. "Nothing," I replied, trying to keep the slippery mound from falling out of my mouth. I stopped chewing and held my breath as her eyes narrowed, fixing her glance on my bulging cheek. She held out her hand. "Give it here," she said sharply. I hesitated, pondering the question that has haunted delinquent gum chewers for millennia: to swallow or not. As I weighed my options, warm saliva pooled at the back of my throat. I struggled against the urge to gag. "No," she said, gritting her teeth and giving me the look. Defeated, I leaned over her cupped hand and let the sticky wad drop from my mouth. Strings of multi-hued saliva dangled from my lips. "Where did you get this?" she asked. I pointed to the large yellow check mark over the entrance to the store. "What were you thinking?" she demanded. opening the car door and motioning for me to slide across the bench seat. I looked up at my mother quizzically. What was I thinking? That it was only candy. Nothing compared with the spoils she routinely tucks into rolls of pants in her suitcase. I thought about the unfinished treat in her hand, and a scream bowled up in the back of my throat. No fair, no fair, no fair! But the deepening crease between her brow gave me pause. Once inside, she grabbed my wrist and walked me back to the customer service counter, where she asked to speak to the manager in her most authoritative, grown-up voice. When he arrived, I had noticed that his name was embroidered in curly white letters on the otherwise plain, ubiquitous blue vest. My mother held out the stiff, viscous evidence of my infraction. It bore the small impressions of my newly acquired molars. "My daughter stole this from your store," she announced. The manager and my mother exchanged glances. Then he crouched down to meet me, eye to eye. His cheeks were lightly pitted like the skin of an orange, and he had a purplish stump where a pinky ought to have been. His breath smelled of cheese. "We take this kind of thing very seriously, young lady," he said, drawing out the E and very to make sure I got the point. He went on to describe what happens to shoplifters at their store. Something about police and handcuffs and my permanent record. I would have paid closer attention, but I couldn't take my eyes off the stump, which wiggled every now and then like a docked tail. Satisfied with his performance, my mother nudged me in the back with her knee. "What do you say to the nice man?" she asked. "Sorry," I said. "Well, I think we can let this one slide," he said with a wink like he had just done me a huge favor. "Just be sure it doesn't happen again, Kay, darling?" With that, my mother dropped my wrist, turned on her kitten heels, and marched toward the exit. I followed behind, dragging my feet and hanging my head in an appropriately contrite posture. We drove home in silence. When we arrived, I retreated to my room, where I immediately removed the remaining piece of undiscovered taffy from my pocket. It was warm, and the fruity bits had melted together, forming sleek, gelatinous rainbow swirls. The pressure of my tiny fist had flattened the round into a caterpillar-like blob with finger-shaped ridges along one side. It didn't look as lovely as it had in the store, but it smelled just as sweet.